Good morning, all. I invite you to join me in our responsive call to worship. Sing aloud to God our strength. Shout for joy to the God of Jacob. With a song, sound the tambourine, play sweet music with the harp. Hear, O my people, while I admonish you, if you would but listen to me. There shall be no strange god among you. You shall not bow down to a foreigner. I am the Lord your God. Open your mouth wide, and I will fill it. I would feed you with the finest of rubies, and with honey from the rock I would satisfy. Dear God, we have known you since the time you led our ancestors from bondage to freedom. We have found no fault in your promise, yet we wander from the path that you have set and put our faith in other gods, which lead us away from justice, compassion, and hospitality. We forsake your blessing. Forgive our faithlessness, and our arrogance. Restore us to the right relationship with you and all those in our midst. God is merciful and slow to anger. God seeks the lost and extends the invitation again and again. God welcomes us when we turn towards God. Friends, believe the good news of the gospel. In Jesus Christ, we are forgiven. I now invite you to stand for our first song, Sharing Wheels. So a warm welcome to everyone this morning, here and online. As usual, we'll be doing morning tea in the barn, so I welcome you to join there after the service. And yeah, just another reminder to keep conversations to the minimum after the service, and maybe continue them in the gallery if you would wish to talk to allow some reflection time. Are there any community news that would like to be brought to the front?
Morning, everyone. Just most of the announcements I want to make are actually in the record, so just make sure you have a look through and see all the various things that are happening. If you're online, you should have got an email with the download for this. If not, make sure you signed up to our email list by emailing the office, and we can make sure that you're connected and getting this as well. There is one very, 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 very important announcement that actually didn't make it onto the record. And it actually fits in with today's theme of sort of banquets and celebration, because I'm sure there was one during the week because someone had a birthday this week and didn't tell me. So it's been Scotty's birthday this week. So Pat, I don't think we have a choice. Happy birthday. Happy birthday to you, Scotty. Announcement's done. Thank you.
I would now like to invite our stewards to come help us take up the offering. God of all creation, all you have made is good, and your love endures forever. You bring forth bread from the earth and fruit from the vine. Thank you for nourishing us with these gifts and allowing us to then give back these gifts in the service of you. Amen. Our next song, Till We Find Home in You, I invite the stand. I now invite Graham to bring us our reading.
I'm reading from Luke's Gospel, chapter 14, verse 1, and then verses 7 to 14. On one occasion, when Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, they were watching him closely. When he noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, he told them a parable. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down in the place of honor, in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your hosts. And the host who invited both of you may come and say to you, "Give this person your place." And then in disgrace you would start to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, "Friend, move up higher." Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. This is the word of the Lord.
I'll just continue on the last couple ones. So he said also to the one who invited him, "When you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers, or your relatives or rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return, and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. And you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." Thank you, Graham. And I invite Keith to come bring us his message today.
Thank you, Shwewa, and thank you, Graham. It was a three-course banquet. We got the first course, and there was an appetizer, and then there are three courses, but no food. 3 stories or parables, and we spared you the longest one, but I'll refer to it in a moment. So it's a dinner of words that we have today in our reading from Luke. Luke's Gospel, food is very important for Luke. Food and hospitality. There are 10, some say 9, some say 10, depends how you count them, meal scenes or references to meal scenes in Luke's Gospel. The other Gospels have 3 or 4, depending on which Gospel. So clearly for Luke, food and eating together is really important for the community he's sharing the gospel with, but also because he knows it was important for the ministry of Jesus. As we've heard in our songs and in the reading, Jesus never knocked back an invitation to a party or a dinner. Didn't matter who asked it, whether they were people of low reputation, sinners, lawyers, tax collectors, people on the shady side in those days. He would eat with them. Or Pharisees, very respectable people. There are 3 of those in Luke where Jesus accepts invitations to those we think are his enemies. They weren't all, of course, but certainly some of the Pharisees provided severe criticism of what Jesus was doing. And Jesus was happy to go to Sunday lunch with them, Sabbath lunch, as in this occasion in chapter 14. We're told that we are what we eat. And we're beginning to realise the consequences of this in our health system and in our bodies today, I suspect. A lifetime of eating white bread, white sugar, highly processed foods, lots of preservatives. We're beginning to see the effects of that. And certainly I think that's something that we should talk about, the ethics of what we eat. And, should we be giving white bread out in our bakehouse? We try to give out the good stuff there. And we have lots of fruit and veggies too, whenever we can get hold of them. But on a Thursday afternoon and Saturday morning, there's a queue right up to Station Street down here, coming in to get food from us. And it's good that we try to make it healthy food. But as we've seen, this story today doesn't actually talk about what Jesus ate. That doesn't happen very often in the Gospels. It does, of course, at the Last Supper, bread and wine. Although in the early church, they would sometimes use fish and water, bread and water, whatever they could for their communion meal. It wasn't just bread and wine, but in our Gospel accounts and in Paul, that's what's talked about. Paul also, in the Timothy tradition, tells us we should have a little wine for our stomach's sake. That's because the alcohol kills the bugs in the water, and the water wasn't too good. It was a bit dodgy in many places, so the recommendation, put a bit of wine in to sort of kill things, and it might be good for your tummy. But there's not much reference to what we eat in the New Testament. They often didn't have very much choice. It was fairly basic food. But there's a lot in the Gospels about how we eat, where we eat. And this seems to be very important for Luke too. And this chapter 14 is all about that, how we eat. And it's a little bit confusing for us because we might have images, something like this, shaped by Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, and think of meal scenes with a big trestle table and tablecloth and people sitting round. Really, it's a wonderful painting, lots of things happening amongst the disciples and others there. But it owes more to medieval thinking, doesn't it? It's a medieval monastery meal. It's not a first century meal at all. That's not how Jesus ate. Most of our famous paintings don't show us how Jesus would have eaten, but they show us how the artists would have eaten. So Rubens' one where Mary anoints Jesus' feet. Luke tells us clearly that the woman who anoints Jesus stands behind him and anoints his feet and wipes her hair on his feet. She'd have to be under the chair if she was going to do that in that painting. Our images of how they ate are shaped by something coming from other periods, the artists. Again, this one Mary always seems to be in red because she's supposed to be a sinner. She's not called Mary, of course, in 3 of the Gospels, only in John. And she's never called Mary Magdalene, the one who anoints Jesus. That's a different story, but we collapse them all together and we construct a picture that fits our own culture. And, well, to an extent, we need to do that. We need to understand what would happen if Jesus came to lunch for us today. We need to talk and think about what it means, but it helps us if we first of all think, how would it have happened then? So that we don't just project back our own assumptions and culture back on to Luke's text. Because there are only 3 chairs mentioned in the New Testament. The ones of the dove sellers in the temple that Jesus turned over with the tables, and the chair or the seat of Moses in Matthew. They don't sit to eat. There are 46 references to sitting, the verb kathizo, and in none of those do the people eat. The one exception, 1 Corinthians 10:7, actually refers back to the golden calf when they sat to eat and rose to play back in Exodus. So it's not a New Testament image. There is no sitting down at table, but we talk about table fellowship. That's just not how they ate. So it's good for us to think about this if we're to understand the places of honour and why that was important to them. Lynn and I were fortunate in those days before COVID, when we could travel, to meet this man, Dennis Smith. He's a Disciples of Christ, Church of Christ professor from Oklahoma. And we were on a sort of an archaeological expedition through Turkey. Here he is in a baptistry in Ephesus, the Church of St. John, and not the very old, one of the oldest baptistries there. But his specialty is meals. He's Mr. Meals of the early Christian world. A couple of his books there. From Symposium, the high-class Greek banquet, to Eucharist, the Lord's Supper. How did the meals change in the culture of the day? The Greek culture, the Symposium, the Roman dinner parties, the Jewish meals, how much were they influenced by Greek and Roman culture? And how might the Lord's Supper, the Passover meal, how might that have happened in the early church? And so many learned articles, very helpful there. Everywhere we went in Turkey, though, he would demonstrate to us that you recline to eat. Here he is lying down in a shrine to Pan up on the island of Pathos, up on Thassos rather, high on the mountain in Thassos. A shelf where they would eat. In the temples, there would be dining rooms, but you lie down and you lean on your left elbow. You never touch food with your left hand, toilet hand, the cleaning hand. You use your right hand to eat and drink. So you're leaning on your left elbow. Everywhere we went, he'd do this to make the point. This is in a much bigger temple in Pergamum, one of the 7 cities of Asia Minor. And he's telling us there, come on over and I want to show you how it works. So he got us all to lie down. Being a left-hander myself, I tried to lie on my right hand. Oh no, that's not allowed. So I was told off and I had to lean on my left. There's Lynn on the right-hand side there, and I'm up in the corner. You would lean on your left shoulder, and this is in the temple where you would have wedding feasts, important celebrations. Every temple had these larger dining rooms, some with built-in triclinium, 3 couches, 3 places for resting. In the houses, they would have small tricliniums where you could fit even just 3 people, or 3 people on each couch, 9 people if you had a bigger dinner party, or there'd be big rooms where you could have many more. And this was how they would eat. This is a replica, at least an artist's impression, built on the archaeology of a big house less than 50 minutes from where Jesus lived in Nazareth. This is Sepphoris. And they've discovered the mosaics. It's all precise detail that the artist has done here, the wall paintings and so forth. This is a wealthy house. This is not a house that Jesus would normally eat in, but it's possible that some of the Pharisees were wealthy. And certainly in Jerusalem, the high priestly homes had tricliniums. They followed the Greco-Roman custom too. You see the 3 couches. In this case, just one person on each couch. There is a seat there. The person sitting down would be a lower class person. It could be one of the host's sons or family members who's coming in to tell him something. You go and sit there and you tell us, and then you go. Not part of the high society. And you have the slave girls, slave boys coming in to serve. And you can see how in that sort of a setting it would be possible for the woman who anointed Jesus to stand behind him and to anoint his feet. She would come in the slave place and stand behind on the side table, or whichever table, a couch it was rather, and anoint his feet and rub his feet with her hair. That's in Luke 7, we have that story. So this is the sort of place where to imagine, sort of scene where to imagine in Luke 14. Jesus is invited to dine with a Pharisee. I know that our translations talk about when he saw the guests sitting in the place of honour and so forth, sitting at table. There is no use of sitting connected with food in the New Testament. Everywhere you see that in your New Testament, you could cross it out and put recline. There are about 10 different words they use, all meaning to lie down, to recline, to eat. We do not have any example of anyone sitting at a table to eat. We have the crumbs falling from the master's table, the woman, the Syrophoenician woman or the Canaanite woman. But of course, that would be the master's table, the little round table next to the head couch there. That would be what that's talking about. They didn't have great big tables around which everyone sat. Sometimes in the small triclinium, they could have a central table, but it's the servants, the slaves, who would come in and bring the food and the drink and keep them supplied with food. What are the places of honour? Well, it's a bit confusing because it varies according to the culture, the size of the room, how many guests you have, and where the best view is. Which couch has the best view of the internal courtyard, in this case, the garden space in the middle? Which place has the best view? And also whether the host is a real host or not, whether the host wants to dominate the banquet or whether the host is making other people feel at home. One common way of doing it was like this. The head table, the green one, would be where you would put your special guests, number 1, 2, 3. The blue table, the lowest table, would be where the family, the host family, might sit. Now, families weren't always present. Women weren't always present. In the 1st century, it's beginning to change. In Greek custom, the only women who would be present would be the courtesans or the dancing girls, certainly not the wives. In Roman custom, in the 1st century, it was beginning to change that respectable women could join the triclinium and eat with the men, but it didn't always happen. The children were kept out of the place unless they were brought in for a particular reason. So there you would have the host sitting there at the top of the host family table, and the most distinguished guest would be right next to him, the pater familias, the boss of the household, of everything in the house. So they can talk. They're leaning on their left elbow and they can face each other across the corner. They can talk without anyone else hearing. Yeah? So you have your closest, the person you want to honour the most, right there, and you can do deals with them and try to gain prestige for your own family if there are various distinguished guests. You see, Mediterranean culture today even, but certainly then, was an agonistic culture. Honour, shame are the most important values. Much more than wealth or fine clothes, the whole question of honour and shame drives every interaction between men. Women don't bring honour, they just have to keep out of the way and not bring shame. They stay at home, married women. If they go out, they must be covered, because if they put a foot wrong, they'll bring shame to their boss man, the head man. So it's a very patriarchal culture, and it's all about the honour of the family name, the father's name. And this is a matter of life and death. If anyone brings shame, if any of the daughters gets pregnant before marriage, then that's death, as it still is in some places in the Middle East today. So when we think of Mary being pregnant before marriage in the Christmas story, this is horrific. This is, Joseph does well to stand by her. So honour and shame are fundamental to every interaction in the culture, and particularly at mealtime. So you put your guests there, the most prominent people that you want to gain honour from, on the green table, going down to the black table, the host family on the left there. That's one way of doing it. Sometimes the host would be on the green table with the people he wants to honour, because there's a better view and he wants, so it varies a bit. We have different theories as to how it works, but this seems to be a common one. It's an interesting thing though, because sometimes there would be a special guest. Maybe that's who Jesus is in this story. The Pharisee wants to bring this fellow along. He's heard about him, and maybe we'll interrogate him over Sunday lunch, Sabbath lunch. See if we can embarrass him and show us how we are right, or maybe it was from genuine motives. I want to hear what he says. Often that person would be put in seat number 5, diagonally opposite the host and the most important person. The outsider, the visiting philosopher or scholar, or the foreigner. Let's put him over there and we can talk across the space to him. See whether the outsider maybe could become an insider or not, or whether he's going to be totally beyond the pale and we can reject him. There's a curious thing in the Greek language that the word for host and the word for stranger is the same word, xenos, from which we get xenophobia, the fear of foreigners. The host is xenos, as in Romans 16:23, Gaius, who is host, xenos, to me and to the whole church, that's in Corinth, sending the letter to Rome, greets you. So Gaius is a big man in the Corinthian church. He may have been the one, Paul doesn't tell us the name, who's causing the problems with the Lord's Supper in Corinth. Remember, they have problems there. 1 Corinthians 11. People are eating in the triclinium. They think it's the Lord's Supper, but the rich people get all the food and some people go hungry. Some people get drunk and some people get nothing. Paul says, that's not the Lord's Supper. That's not how Jesus eats. That is no way a communion of equals. And Paul tells them off. It may be even that Gaius is the problem because he's got a big house and he can afford to do that. We don't know, but some have suggested that. But you see how xenos is used in the parable in Matthew 25. I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, a xenos, and you welcomed me. Hospitality. Isn't it a strange thing that the same word should be used? So you could have a xenos host and a xenos stranger. The Pharisee in our story today is the xenos, the host. Jesus is the outsider. What is going to happen? What will Jesus say in that context? Now, of course, when we go for morning tea in the barn, we have two lovely big couches there. So I'm expecting to see you. I'll have a look and see if you've been listening. Who will get the places of honour? Will you recline on your left elbow and drink the coffee? It's interesting, isn't it? How do we shape our conversations? How do we sit around the table? This is a culture, very hierarchical, patriarchal culture, where how you eat shapes who you are and who your community is. Not just your own body, but the body, the communal body. I suggest it still does today in ways we don't often think about, but it's even more so then. We can see this insider-outsider thing in the wonderful story in Luke 24:30, the end of the road to Emmaus. They are walking back to their home, we presume, in Emmaus, and a stranger joins them, and they discuss what has happened at the time of the crucifixion of Jesus. And they get to Emmaus, and the stranger is going to keep walking. They say, "Oh, no, come in. It's late. Come in and have supper with us." So he comes in and joins them. And as he was at the table, bad translation, as he was reclining, is the word, yeah? As he was reclining with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. You think, hang on, isn't he the outsider? Suddenly he's become the host. Breaks the bread, gives it to them. What happens? He disappears. And they go running back uphill all the way to Jerusalem, because it was in the breaking of the bread that the penny dropped, that they realised this is the risen Jesus. This is how Jesus is still alive with us today. The outsider becomes the insider and shares bread with us. This is my body. Okay? Wonderful moment in Luke's narrative. So, our story is sort of the middle one of the 9 or 10 meal scenes. All the way through Luke, we have a recurring theme that Jesus eats with people he shouldn't eat with. That begins back in chapter 5. He's accused of being a glutton and a drunkard, because that's the sort of people he eats with. That's repeated after this chapter in Luke 15. The same charge comes up. This fellow eats with tax collectors and sinners. And so there's a whole series of teaching things happening there in Luke 15, including the parable of the lost and the found, that the outsider is welcomed by the father who runs to embrace the disgraced son. Honour and shame are turned upside down again in those parables. Then it goes through to the road to Emmaus, these stories. We should say Graham read to us the first verse, and then from verse 7, which is indeed the lectionary reading, but in the gap in between, after Jesus is invited to eat with the Pharisee, there's a story of a man with dropsy, some medical condition that Jesus heals. And it's on the Sabbath day, of course. So there's a bit of a controversy there. Should Jesus heal on the Sabbath day or not? And Jesus said, well, if your animal or your child fell into a pit, of course you'll pull them out. Doesn't matter what day it is. So why can't I help someone who needs help? It's not clear then what happens to the man with dropsy. It's unlikely that he would join the meal. He's too much of an outsider. But all the way through then, the rest of chapter 14, we have references to the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, as we'll see in the stories that follow. So Jesus is challenging this idea of elite meals, because even though in the first century ancient world, that is the way everyone would like to eat, reclining with slaves to come and serve them, the slaves never get to recline. The people living in poor houses in Nazareth don't get to recline. They eat in a very different way. So it's interesting as we analyse the gospel text, see which, or the New Testament text, which writers assume that meals are reclining meals and which don't. You can talk in the Greek language about eating and drinking without referring to whether you're reclining or sitting or whatever. Sitting is what the barbarians do in Germany. Now, that's why they're barbarians. Cultured people recline. And of course, low-class people, slaves and so forth, well, they can get whatever they can standing up in the kitchen afterwards. They can eat the scraps, the leftovers, perhaps. So which of the gospel writers is sensitive to this difference? Luke clearly is sensitive to it, but he sets all his meals as reclining meals. The other gospel writers don't so much. Luke has many more. Paul is ultra sensitive. He never talks about fine dining, reclining to dine, with one exception, reclining in the temple in front of the idol. He said, don't eat meat there, because people will be misled by what you're doing. But everywhere else, Paul is careful to just use the ordinary word for eat and drink and not specify whether it's upper class eating or lower class eating. Because in the Pauline communities, so far as we can tell, more than half the members were slaves who would never recline. And as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11, to share the Lord's Supper, if you're hungry, eat what you can at home, then come and have a simple meal, which is, of course, what we do, what we'll do next week. We don't have a full meal for the Lord's Supper anymore. We tend to have a simple thing which is equally shared. And if we're hungry, we can eat at home beforehand or afterwards at morning tea. It's a way around that problem. And Paul affirms that as being better than having a full meal where some people get most of the food because they're honoured guests and some people out in the courtyard or who are serving miss out altogether. So the first thing that Jesus does is to heal a man with dropsy. Then they come into the dinner, and the reading that we've had talks about who should sit where. He noticed how the guests chose the places of honour. Sometimes they'll be told where they're sitting by the host. Sometimes they'll proceed on the assumption that they'll be at the high table. And Jesus suggests you shouldn't do that. Go for the low table and maybe you'll be upgraded. Don't, it's a bit like trying to get upgraded on an aircraft, isn't it? People dress up in suits and look like a businessman and hope that they'll get the upgrade to business class. It's a bit of a funny story because, of course, once you're upgraded, you're still reinforcing the honour-shame values. It's almost like you've just swapped places. You think, well, that's not very transformative. It's the first step, though. That is, that people should not seek the high places of honour. That we should have a realistic understanding of ourselves and not value ourselves as better than others. Yeah? Be humble. Those who exalt themselves will be humble, but those who are humble themselves will be exalted. The humble, the meek, shall inherit the earth, says Jesus. Not the powerful, who seem to think they are these days. Not the warlords and the Putins and whatever else, but the humble and the meek shall in the end inherit the earth. So that's the first course, if you like. Starting to pull at the customs and traditions of the meal. Jesus changes the places, the seating of honour. We'd love to know, where then did Jesus sit? Did he try to go for the low place? Was he lifted up to the high? We don't know. I think Luke has just arranged this series of stories in this setting to provoke us to think, to make us think about these traditions and customs. Then he said also to the one who had invited him, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or brothers or relatives or rich neighbours, in case they may invite you in return, and you would be repaid. When you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame and the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. Not just the seating places, but the guest list here. Jesus starts to challenge the host on. Now, why are you inviting all these people? So that you can gain honour from them and they can give you honour and you can pat each other on the back? Why don't you invite those who really need a meal? Jesus may include himself in that category. Then it moves on to the long parable story. One of the dinner guests, on hearing this, said to him, "Blessed is anyone who will eat bread in the kingdom of God." Very pious thought. Jesus said to him, "Someone gave a great dinner and invited many. At the time for the dinner, he sent his slave to say to those who had been invited, 'Come, for everything is ready now.' But they all alike began to make excuses." We know this story, we know the song, I cannot come to the banquet. We probably know Matthew's version better, because that's the banquet of a king, a wedding banquet for his son. And we have the same excuses trotted out. The invited guests do not come. This is shameful. To think that you invite people and they don't come. No wonder then the owner of the house became very angry. Verse 21 there. Then the owner of the house became very angry and said to his slave, "Go out at once into the streets and lanes of the town and bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame." Again, a connection back to the man with dropsy. And the slave said, "Sir, what you ordered has been done, and there is still room." Then the master said to the slave, "Go out into the roads and lanes and compel people to come in, so that my house may be filled. My honour depends on it. For I tell you, none of those who are invited will taste my dinner." Now, bizarrely, some people interpret this as God giving a messianic banquet, and it's the Jews who reject, and it's we Gentiles who get dragged in at the end. That's an awful interpretation. Doesn't fit in Luke at all. It's confused, I think, because where it says sir and the master, the word is Kyrios, or kurios, Lord. But of course in Greek, that's just the word for Mr., sir. That's in Jewish Greek, Kyrios is used to translate Yahweh. That's a different matter. But when we see the word kurios, Lord, we shouldn't assume that it must refer to Jesus or to God. In normal Greek culture, no, it's just a term of respect for any man. Sir, master. So some people, I think, look at the Greek word and think, oh, this must be Jesus or must be God, and God's angry. No, this is a story Jesus is telling. It's the third course in the banquet, pulling at the strings of the customs and the culture, turning upside down all their expectations. Here you have a powerful man trying to give a dinner banquet that will bring him honour and glory, and it all falls apart. And he gets angry and he tries to bring in anyone to fill up the seats because he can't bear to have an empty room. But you cannot compel people. Yeah? The solution to the kingdom of God, the basileia of God is not a place where the powerful compel others to do things. It's a place where all are invited, as we've been singing. It's an open banquet for everyone equally. It's not a banquet given by an angry man who wants to keep his reputation by compelling people. This is a story of the collapse of Greco-Roman high dining culture. If it's based on honour and shame, it's not part of the kingdom of God. It's not part of the basileia. That's not how it works, says Jesus. And Luke does this in other places, these wonderful stories that show how the rich and powerful misunderstand completely. Think of the rich man and Lazarus. That wonderful, it's a joke. It's a wonderful story, really funny story. But we think, oh no, this is a picture of hell or heaven or get all. No, it's a joke story. How the rich man is in Hades, in torment, and he looks at the poor man Lazarus, who was covered in sores on his doorstep all through his life, and says to Father Abraham, send Lazarus to me to put some cold water on my lips because it's really hot here. He still doesn't understand. He still thinks as a powerful man he can give orders. Yeah? Doesn't understand the nature of the revelation of the good news through Jesus. That it's not about power and wealth. It's about community and love being in the one body, including those who have been, especially those who have been excluded for so long. You cannot compel people to come in that way. So, guess who's coming to Sunday lunch? Well, Jesus might mess up our place settings, our assumptions about who sits at the head of the table. Jesus messes up the guest list as well. You shouldn't have invited these people. You should have invited other people. And Jesus messes up the power structures underlying all of that. Not just about meals and food, but about the whole nature of society. The patriarchal power structures are not part of the basileia of God. They are not part of how God transforms our lives. Wonderful example of this, and I'll push it through quickly. In our Indigenous culture here, the hospitality of our Indigenous people in this land and the question of power. This picture was, I think it hung in every primary classroom that I was, Albert Namatjira's wonderful watercolour of one of the first to sort of paint it like it really is in the colours that are there. He was, of course, Albert Namatjira, one of the first Indigenous people ever to get the vote and become an Australian citizen, which was sort of forced, I think, on the Aussies because he became a British subject because the royals loved his watercolours and he became a British subject, so he was given Australian citizenship so he could vote even before the referendum. Very interesting story. His another wonderful scene, Gough Whitlam and the dust from Wave Hill. After the Wave Hill walk-off, the longest protest industrial action in Australian history, where the Indigenous stockmen walked off because they were only being paid flour and sugar and so on. They wanted to have proper jobs, and Lord Vestey's big property there, the powerful, eventually agreed to give it to the Indigenous people. It was their land after all. And Gough Whitlam, of course, was the one who poured the sand and said to Vincent, I solemnly hand you these deeds as proof in Australian law that these lands belong to the Gurindji people, and I put into your hands part of the earth itself as a sign that this land will be the possession of you and your children forever. It took another 10 years for it to become a reality. A lot of legal wrangling to go on. In response, Vincent Lingiari, in his own language, said, let us live happily together as mates. Let us not make it hard for each other. We want to live in a better way together, Aboriginals and white men. Let us not fight over anything. Let us be mates. Interesting, subversive challenge to power, isn't it? And I see this Vincent Namatjira. Vincent from Vincent Lingiari, Namatjira from his grandfather, direct descendant, who was an artist who painted this wonderful picture of himself. It's in the Archibald exhibition. I think this is in the Sulman section. Painted this of himself on the balcony, Buckingham Palace. And his comments with it are wonderful. Might be a bit confronting for us. Think, oh, how disrespectful. This is what he says. For me, the canvas is a setting where I can combine the past, the present, and possible futures. And I can put myself as a proud Aboriginal man at the front and centre of a situation where we would usually be out of sight. The Queen and royal family are interconnected with my own family history. My great-grandfather, Albert Namatjira, met Queen Elizabeth back in 1954, and the royal family owns some of his watercolour paintings. In this painting, I'm on equal footing with the royals. That's good gospel news. We're all on equal footing. I'm just about to suggest that we head inside the palace for a cup of tea and take a look at those Namatjira watercolours. And then this was the one that was in the Archibald Prize. It's interesting that the painting of Albert Namatjira by William Dargie was the first Aboriginal portrait to win the Archibald Prize, and Vincent Namatjira's portrait of Adam Goodes, the footballer, was the first time the Archibald Prize was won by an Indigenous artist. This is him, again, putting himself on the throne. Subversive challenge to power and authority. Putting myself in a position of power and influence like this, sitting on a throne, puts me way out of my comfort zone, he says, of this self-portrait with its references to royal portraits. My studio work boots and the old paint buckets are a bit like me, totally out of place in this formal setting. This space is usually reserved for royalty. And if I want to take it over, I've got to build up my confidence, and I'm going to need some protection. I need a paintbrush. That's my weapon. Because for me, painting means pride and the power to change things. The dingo is a protector, there to guard me. The Queen's got her corgis by her side, you know, so I've got my dingo, just as long as it doesn't pee on the carpet. Wonderful, subversive but respectful challenges to power. Luke and Mark tell the story of one of the ultimate banquets in the gospel. We have the Lord's Supper, of course, as the final one, and then the Emmaus Road one in Luke. The Greek has got all scrambled here, but that's all right. I've translated it how I would like to translate. I like Mark's account because he particularly uses, Luke's is very similar, but Mark uses the word for the Greek high dining, symposium. The only time in the New Testament occurs this fine dining in Greek culture. And so Jesus said to them, how many loaves have you got? Go and see. And when they found out, they said 5 and 2 fish, the feeding of the 5,000 in the wilderness. Then he ordered them all, the usual translation, ordered them all to get the people to sit down in groups on the green grass. Wow, that misses the point. It really reads, and he ordered them all to recline symposium by symposium on the green grass. And they reclined group by group in hundreds and fifties. 50 is the Jubilee number. So this is a Jubilee feast in the wilderness, far away from the city markets and the powerful, and they share their food equally together. There's enough left over, 12 baskets for all the Jews, and the other feeding, 7 baskets for all the Gentiles. and they are fine dining on the green grass. It's a wonderful, gentle, subversive challenge to the fine dining of the day. So, friends, come to the banquet. There's a place for you. Our final hymn, we're going to sing it, I hope, here. I might need to get Shui Hua to work that for me, if that's all right. Come to the banquet, there's a place for you. Another song by our wonderful local songwriters, Faye White. We've had George Stewart, we've had Ross Langmead. This is Faye White. And the refrain, that's the refrain. Let's sing that a couple of times. Come to the banquet, there's a place for you. Come to the banquet, there's a place for you. Once more. Come to the banquet, there's a place for you. Though you maybe have no money, though you maybe feel unworthy, in your strength and in your weakness, you are welcome. Come to the banquet, there's a place for you. See, you are an honored guest, from constant serving you may rest. So sit you down, be fed and blessed, for you are welcome. Come to the banquet, there's a place for you. Come to the banquet, there's a place for you. Woman, wise one, mother, maiden, see your plate with food is laden, and your place is set and waiting. You are welcome. Come to the banquet, there's a place for you. Work up, father, little boy, old man or youth without employ. Come, rest your worry, here is joy, and you are welcome. Come to the banquet, there's a place for you. Whether you've been lost or faithful, whether you've been wise or wasteful, here's a place and rest and grace, and you are welcome. Come to the banquet, there's a place for you. Come to the banquet, there's a place for you. Here is one who runs to meet you, loving arms stretched out to reach you. Do not let your fear defeat you, you are welcome. Come to the banquet, there's a place for you. Come to the banquet, there's a place for you.
We come to a time of prayer and reflection now, so please take the spaces I leave as time to reflect on your own thoughts that you would like to bring. And then straight after the prayer, we'll move on to the benediction. So, ready for that. Lord, you invite us every day to bask under your grace, to find joy and love hidden in the small, quiet actions. We think of those who struggle to find peace, whether to inner conflict or outer conflict. Those who live in fear of violence from people supposed to love and care for them. Those whose world has collapsed around them because of war and conquest. We think now of the people Jesus came to serve, and we ask that you be with them in their times of distress, as you are with us in our time of content. We are filled with bread and honey, giving us the strength and sweetness to move through our day, spreading your goodwill. Our thoughts go to the ones who do not have enough: food, money, opportunities, respect, and care. Those forgotten and left to build themselves up alone. Those that society has abandoned: the poor, the sick, and the imprisoned, literally and figuratively. We think now of the people Jesus came to serve, and we ask that you guide us into bringing a holy hospitality to them. When we are full from your love, from the love of those around us, and we are content to be among friends and family, let us remember all those who do not feel safe, who cannot be warm due to oppression and hate, those who cannot find comfort among their family, those who struggle with the world and sometimes their own self against them. We think now of the people Jesus came to serve, and we pray that we have the strength to share our burdens and help to carry the burdens of those around us. Loving God, we understand that you do little to stand in the way of our movement from feast to the empty bowl. We just pray that you will always be a presence at our sides, that we will not lose sight of bringing your love out into the world. Amen. Blessed is God who has fed and nourished us with his bountiful gifts by his grace and by his compassion, always, now, and ever, and unto ages. Go in peace.